You need only turn on the news in recent weeks to become concerned about gun violence in Anchorage. What is your plan for reducing gun violence in Anchorage?
There's no question, when we talk about correlation of crime and number of police officers, there is one. And my plan for reducing this is, number one, we have got to, as a community, get involved, no question. Communication is key. But number two, we absolutely have to reinvest in APD. What we see with APD is when we see overtime numbers, especially cost going up, we know we're not staffing appropriately. As an assembly member, I have been advocating to bolster those numbers, but I think we have to go back to some of these specialty units, whether we're talking about the gang unit, whether we're talking about different drug units, whether we're talking about property crime. There's correlations with all of those, and we have to adequately staff our police department before we can start to address this issue. But it's not just the police. We have to get involved as citizens. We have to start engaging in these conversations. That's the way to start to address this issue.
Thank you. Homelessness increases the likeliness of being a victim of violent crime and/or exploitation. One significant problem facing Anchorage's homeless population is a lack of appropriate housing. Recognizing the imminent economic strain on the state and municipality, what is your plan to address this problem within the continuum of detox facilities, residential addiction recovery, housing first options, particularly to ensure that Carlick Manor is able to maintain operation and affordable housing for low-income individuals?
I love this question because I've actually been working on this issue. So there's no question detox is going to be a piece of this puzzle, so is housing. But the other thing we need to engage, people will talk about the different native corporations, but one of the things we're missing, when we look at the population, disproportionately, Alaska Natives make up this. So as an assembly member, over the last couple of months, I have already been meeting with tribal elders. We're not talking about the native corporations. We're talking about tribes. These are their members. We have to start engaging these tribes. And why? Because no one has ever done this before. But the tribes have access to federal funding. They have access to mental health care. They have access to job training, revenues, sources. But we have to engage them in the conversation. When we talk about we are Anchorage, we can't just talk about the individuals. We have to remember a big portion of our population, they're members of tribes. So why aren't they at the table?
Many of our community strategies to address violence focus on dealing with the immediate and long-term aftermath of violence that has already occurred. But in order to effectively reduce violence, we must focus on primary prevention. We're stopping violence before it ever occurs in the first place. What is your understanding of primary prevention strategies, and which strategies would you prioritize for Anchorage in your role as mayor?
Well, it's nice to talk about primary prevention, when we're talking about education, when we're talking about, domestic violence, when we're talking about all these different things, you have to identify first what's the issue. But, prevention is not going to serve us alone. We absolutely, the number one thing I have been saying that's facing the city of Anchorage right now is APD staffing. That is the number one issue we have. There's a lot of other issues on the table, absolutely. But when we're identifying prevention issues or we're identifying different areas that we can invest in, whether it's education, treatment, domestic violence, alcohol abuse, whatever those issues are, we cannot deal with that alone. It has to be an investment in APD. And that means additional staffing, that means bringing back specialty units. We have got to do that first. We have got to. And when people start talking about funding, I'm here to tell you right now, I sit on the Anchorage Assembly, and I'll bet you each a piece of pizza that we're going to have a surplus this year. We can do this, but this has to be our priority. Has to be.
Thank you. Amy, the next question is for you.
Give me a good one.
Well, now that you said that. Mental trauma from exposure to violence has been scientifically shown to increase a person's risk of adopting violent behavior themselves, meaning that violent behavior transmits and spreads based on exposure. What are your thoughts on responding to violence as a public health epidemic? Should the health sector be involved in violence prevention?
I did not want this question, but that's okay. I wanted Ethan's question. We'll get there. You know, obviously, I'm not going to say that violence is a public health epidemic. Do I think that exposure to violence might lead to propensity of violence? Absolutely. Studies have shown that to be accurate. But it comes back to personal responsibility. I mean, when we have, as a community, and the person has to take responsibility for their actions, no question. But as a community, we have a moral obligation to help people that are mentally ill. So when we start talking about these issues, you know, when we talk about homeless, when we talk about mental illness, when we talk about violence, we have to identify those who need help, honestly. And we have to make sure that help is available to them, no question. But what we also know, when we look, people can't be forced to be institutionalized. So people have to want to be helped. Well, in some instances they can, but people have to want to be helped. We have to make sure those services are available to them, no question. You know, but it goes back to what is our primary responsibility here, and it's to protect the public. We have to have services available, we have to adequately fund it, but we have to have our priorities in line. And that first starts with personal responsibility with each and every one of us.
Do you think the APD personnel reflects the community of Anchorage?
I do. They are our community. You forgot my timer. I'll just keep going. See, I'm a politician, but I'm an honest one. You know, what can I say? These men and women do reflect our community, why they are our community. Some people will measure a reflection of community by race, by gender, by socioeconomic status, not me. I measure it by my neighbor. They are our community, and I'm proud that they're our community. You know, and since I have 30 seconds, I want to go back to Ethan's question. When we were talking about, you know, officers and what their role is, and talking about the Brother Francis shelter, I'm sorry, but it is not APD's job to babysit the Brother Francis shelter. They have got to focus on their own. Catholic Social Services has got to step up, and they have got to police their own entity. But to go back, and just for edification, there is a first aid station at Brother Francis shelter, though it's not always staffed. It's generally volunteer staff from students from UAA. So, you know, there are things we can do, but we have to understand the focus of policing is to police.